September 23rd, 2002. Sydney Harbour. A luxury cruise liner worth $290 million sat gleaming at the wharf. 29,000 tons of polished steel, 14 passenger decks, 1,800 passengers boarding for 10 days of tropical indulgence. The Pacific Sky. They called her a floating resort. 7 bars, 2 nightclubs, a medical center with 2 doctors, a promise of safety at sea. But within 18 hours of departure, a mother from Brisbane would be found dead in a cabin she was never supposed to enter. 8 men, 150 deleted photographs, a reformatted memory card, and a toxicology report that would take 3 weeks to reveal what had actually killed her. This is the dark story of the Pacific Sky Cruise. Party, drugs, and a tragic death. We're going to cover everything. From the ship's advertised luxury, to the night a woman disappeared from a nightclub, to what investigators found in an 11.7 square meter cabin, to why it took 8 years for anyone to face consequences. The question isn't what happened. It's why no one stopped it when they could. The boarding ramp was narrow. Families shuffled forward with wheeled luggage, couples in matching visors, retirees with sun hats already on. The ship's crew stood at intervals, smiling, directing traffic. White uniforms, pressed sharp. The Pacific Sky had been built in Denmark in 1984. Originally named Jubilee, she'd sailed under different flags, different names. By 2002, she was aging but serviceable. Her carpets were thick. Her brass was polished daily. Her engines burned 200 tons of fuel per day at cruising speed. She could maintain 18 knots in calm seas. The itinerary was simple. 10 days. Sydney to Noumea, New Caledonia. Then to Port Vila, Vanuatu. Then back. The route was well worn. P&O had been running these Pacific Island cruises for decades. The ships moved in predictable loops, carrying Australians out to warm water and duty-free shopping, then returning them bronzed and slightly poorer. The Pacific Sky offered 7 bars, 2 nightclubs, a casino with 42 slot machines and 6 card tables, a theatre with cabaret shows nightly, 3 swimming pools, a spa, a medical center with 2 doctors and 4 nurses, 978 crew members from 31 countries. The crew-to-passenger ratio was roughly 1:2. Not generous, but standard for the industry. Among the passengers that morning was Diane Brimble, 42 years old, from Brisbane. She traveled with her daughter, who was 12, and 2 family friends. Diane had booked an inside cabin on Deck C, no window. But that was fine. She didn't plan to spend much time in the room. She'd recently divorced. The cruise was meant to be a reset, a chance to laugh again, to dance, to feel like herself. She wore a floral top that morning. Her hair was dark, shoulder length. She smiled often. People who knew her said she was warm, trusting, the kind of person who made friends easily. The Pacific Sky left port at 11:30 a.m. The engines rumbled to life, a low vibration that traveled through the decks, through the walls, into the bones of everyone aboard. The ship turned slowly in the harbor, then pointed east. The water was flat. The sky was cloudless. By noon, Sydney was a smudge on the horizon. By 2 p.m., it was gone. Life at sea has a particular texture. The hum of ventilation systems, constant and low. The faint smell of salt and cleaning chemicals. The way sound behaves differently in corridors with no windows, no outside reference. Time stretches. Routine becomes elastic. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 7. But between those markers, hours dissolve. People drink earlier than they would on land. They gamble in the afternoon. They flirt with strangers because the ship is a closed world, and consequences feel temporary. The Pacific Sky's public spaces were designed for indulgence. The grand atrium rose through 3 decks, lit by a chandelier with 468 bulbs. The Marquee Lounge seated 380 people for shows. The disco, called the Palace, had a dance floor that could hold 200 bodies when packed. The bars had names like Horizon, the Crow's Nest, the Schooner. Each served the same drinks, but with different views, different moods. The casino stayed open until 4 a.m. most nights. The slot machines chimed endlessly, a digital tinnitus that bled into the hallways. The cabins were smaller than most passengers expected. The standard inside cabin measured 135 square feet. A double bed, a small bathroom, a closet, a television bolted to the wall. The walls were thin. You could hear your neighbors, their laughter, their arguments, their intimacy. Privacy was an illusion on a ship this size. Cabin D, 182, was on Deck D, an inside cabin, 4 berths. It was occupied by 4 men from Adelaide. They'd booked the cruise together. 8 men total in their group, spread across 2 cabins. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 30s. They worked in trades, carpentry, plumbing. One was a factory supervisor. They'd known each other for years. They'd pooled money for this trip. Their goal, stated openly to anyone who asked, was to party, to drink heavily, to meet women, to do things they wouldn't do at home. By the time the Pacific sky cleared the headlands, the Adelaide group was already drinking. The ship's liquor was duty-free. A bottle of vodka cost $12 Australian. Beer was $3 a pint. The men moved between the bars, testing the territory. They were loud, confident. They wore tank tops and board shorts. They carried themselves like they owned the space. Other passengers noticed them, whispered about them. By evening, the ship's crew had flagged them informally, not for any specific violation, just a general awareness. Rowdy, watch them. That first night, the Pacific Sky offered a welcome aboard party. The Marquee Lounge filled with passengers in resort wear. The ship's band played covers of 70s hits. People danced. The bars were 3 deep. Diane Brimble went to karaoke first. She sang with her daughter and friends. She was cheerful, energetic. She had a decent voice. She chose upbeat songs. ABBA, Madonna. After karaoke, she moved to the Palace, the disco. The music was louder there. The lights were low, pulsing in reds and blues. The dance floor was crowded. Diane danced. She accepted drinks from people she'd just met. This was normal on a cruise. Everyone bought rounds. Everyone mingled. The ship encouraged it. Strangers became friends over shared cocktails and the artificial closeness of being surrounded by ocean. The Adelaide men were at the Palace too. They'd been there since 10 p.m., drinking steadily, scanning the crowd. They approached women with blunt propositions. Some women laughed and walked away. Others engaged. The men had brought drugs. Specifically, GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate, a liquid, usually colorless and nearly tasteless. It was used recreationally in some circles, a party drug. In small doses, it caused euphoria, lowered inhibitions, increased sociability. In larger doses, it caused unconsciousness, respiratory depression, death. The line between the two was narrow, unpredictable. The men called it fantasy among themselves. They carried it in small bottles, tucked in pockets. They offered it to women they met, sometimes openly, sometimes not. The timeline of Diane's movements that night is reconstructed from witness statements and fragments. She was seen dancing near midnight. She was seen talking to a man later identified as Mark Wilhelm, one of the Adelaide group. He was shorter than her, stocky, with a shaved head. They seemed to be getting along. She accepted a drink from him. Whether she knew what was in it, no one can say with certainty. GHB dissolves easily in alcohol. It amplifies the effects of liquor. A few milliliters can render someone incapacitated. By 1 a.m., Diane was visibly intoxicated. She stumbled. Her speech slurred. Witnesses saw her leaning on Wilhelm. Another man from the group, Ryan Kuckel, was nearby. They were guiding her, or corralling her. Perspectives differ. She laughed at something. She seemed compliant, drunk but not alarmed. They moved toward the exit of the disco. The lights swirled. The music pounded. No one stopped them. Why would they? It looked like a woman leaving with men she'd been drinking with. Normal cruise behavior. The corridors on Deck D were narrow, beige walls, low ceilings, fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. The carpet was industrial, patterned to hide stains. Cabin D-182 was midship, starboard side. The door opened inward. Inside, the space was cramped. 4 beds, 2 bunks stacked on each side. A small bathroom with a shower stall you had to enter sideways. A table bolted to the floor. The air conditioning rattled. The walls were thin enough to hear conversations from neighboring cabins. What happened inside that cabin is partially documented by photos later recovered from a digital camera. The images were deleted, reformatted, but forensic experts retrieved them. 150 photos in total. They were never released publicly. Those who saw them in court described them as degrading, explicit. Diane, partially clothed or naked, in positions that suggested she was not conscious. Or not fully conscious. The men, grinning, posing. Some photos showed her on the floor, motionless. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was pale. The coroner would later state that the photos indicated Diane had been exploited in her final hours, that she was incapable of consent, that the men were aware of this and proceeded anyway. The photos also showed something else: timestamps. The last photo of Diane alive was taken at approximately 4:17 a.m. The first photo of her clearly in distress, unresponsive, was around 5 a.m. In those minutes, something shifted. The men realized she wasn't waking up. She wasn't breathing properly. Her lips may have turned blue. Witnesses from the inquest testified that some of the men panicked. Others were dismissive. One allegedly said she was faking it. Another suggested they just leave her and go back to the bar. Mark Wilhelm, according to later testimony, tried to rouse her, shook her, slapped her face lightly. Nothing worked. The ship's medical center was contacted at 5:32 a.m. The call came from one of the men in the cabin. The exact words were not recorded, but the medical log noted it as a female passenger, unconscious, possible drug overdose. The ship's doctor, a general practitioner from the Philippines, and 2 nurses responded. They arrived at cabin D-182 at approximately 5:38 a.m. 6 minutes. Not bad for a ship that size. They knocked. The door opened. The doctor later described the scene as chaotic. The cabin smelled of alcohol, of sweat. Diane was on the floor between the bunks. She was naked, or nearly so. Reports vary. No pulse, no respiration. Her skin was cool. The men in the cabin were agitated, defensive. One said she'd taken drugs on her own. Another said they'd just met her. The doctor began CPR immediately. The nurses fetched equipment. A defibrillator, oxygen. They worked on her for 23 minutes. At 6:01 a.m., the doctor pronounced her dead. The ship's captain was notified. The Pacific sky was 12 hours out of Sydney, roughly 220 nautical miles east. In international waters, jurisdiction was murky. The ship was Australian flagged, which meant Australian law applied in theory. But enforcement at sea is complicated. The captain ordered the cabin sealed. Security was called. The men were separated and told to remain in their respective cabins pending investigation. Diane Brimble had been aboard the Pacific Sky for less than 18 hours. She'd sung karaoke with her daughter. She'd danced. She'd accepted drinks from strangers. She'd entered a cabin with men she didn't know, and now she was dead on the floor, her body cooling in the recycled air of Deck D, while the ship continued east at 18 knots, the engines humming through the walls, indifferent. Her daughter was still asleep in their cabin. She didn't know yet. The sun was rising. The Pacific sky moved through calm seas. Passengers were beginning to wake, ordering room service, planning their day, unaware that somewhere below them, in a cramped cabin sealed with yellow tape, a woman's life had ended in circumstances that would take 8 years to partially untangle. The ship breathed. The ship moved. The ship carried evidence across borders, through jurisdictions, into waters where accountability dissolves like sugar in warm liquid. The ship's medical center on the Pacific sky was located on Deck B, near the bow. It consisted of 2 examination rooms, a small pharmacy, a recovery area with 4 beds, and an office where the doctors kept their logs. The facility was equipped for routine maritime emergencies, broken bones, heart attacks, appendicitis. The staff could stabilize serious cases until the ship reached port or a medical evacuation could be arranged. But the center was not designed for forensic work. There was no morgue, no proper cold storage. When someone died at sea, the body was kept in the ship's provisions refrigerator, among the food stores, until arrangements could be made. Diane's body was moved from cabin D182 at approximately 6:45 a.m. The ship's crew used a stretcher covered with a white sheet. They took service corridors away from passenger areas, Deck D to Deck B, through narrow passages that smelled of industrial cleaner and cooking oil from the nearby galleys. The body was placed in a refrigerated compartment normally used for storing meat. The temperature was set to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to slow decomposition, but not ideal for preserving forensic evidence. The doctor noted the time and location in the medical log. He also noted visible signs, no obvious trauma, no bruising on the neck or wrists, pupils dilated and fixed. Rigor mortis had not yet set in. The doctor suspected a drug overdose immediately. The men in the cabin had been evasive, but one had mentioned fantasy. The doctor knew the term GHB. He'd seen cases before, though never fatal ones. He ordered blood and urine samples taken before the body was refrigerated. The samples were stored in the medical center's small lab freezer. These samples would later prove crucial. By 7 a.m., the ship's security team had begun interviewing the Adelaide men. The Pacific Sky employed a security force of 8 officers, ex-police mostly, Australians and Filipinos. They were trained for theft, disputes, the occasional drunk passenger, not homicide investigation. The interviews were conducted in a small office near the casino. Each man was questioned separately. Their stories were inconsistent. Mark Wilhelm said Diane had come to the cabin willingly, that she'd taken GHB of her own accord, that they'd had consensual sex, that she'd seemed fine, then suddenly wasn't. Ryan Kuschel said he'd been asleep in the top bunk, hadn't seen much, didn't know her name until she was already unconscious. Another man, Letterio Silvestri, claimed he wasn't even in the cabin when it happened. He'd been at the casino. The security officers took notes by hand. They had no recording equipment, no formal chain of custody protocols. They were doing their best with limited resources. The cabin itself was photographed. The security team used a standard point-and-shoot camera. 36 exposures. They documented the layout, the unmade beds, empty bottles on the table, vodka, rum, mixers, a wet towel on the floor. The photos were rudimentary. No scale markers, no close-ups of potential evidence. One of the security officers noticed a digital camera on the table, a small silver Olympus. He picked it up, scrolled through the photos, found images of the night before. Diane, the men. He removed the memory card, put it in his pocket. This was not proper procedure. The memory card should have been sealed as evidence immediately. Instead, It changed hands 3 times over the next 12 hours. A crew member took it. Later, it was recovered, but by then it had been reformatted. The photos were deleted. Only later, through forensic recovery, were they retrieved. The ship's captain, a 58-year-old veteran named Graham Warwick, faced a decision. He could turn the ship around, return to Sydney immediately. That would add roughly 12 hours to the voyage. Or he could continue to Noumea as scheduled, arriving in 36 hours, and hand the matter to French authorities. Or he could keep going, complete the cruise, and return to Sydney as planned in 10 days. Each option had implications. Turning around would inconvenience 1,803 passengers. Many had paid for a 10-day cruise. P&O's liability would be significant. Continuing meant keeping a dead body in refrigeration for days. It also meant potential contamination of evidence. Memories fade. People talk. Stories solidify. Captain Warwick consulted with P&O's shore-based management via satellite phone. The conversation lasted 18 minutes. The decision was made. The Pacific Sky would continue to Noumea. But from there, instead of proceeding to Vanuatu, the ship would return directly to Sydney. The cruise would be cut short. Passengers would be refunded for the missed days. This was presented as a mechanical issue, an engine problem. The captain made an announcement over the ship's public address system at 9:30 a.m. His voice was calm, professional. He expressed regret for the inconvenience. He did not mention a death, but word was already spreading. Passengers on Deck D had seen the stretcher, the yellow tape on cabin D-182. Rumors began circulating. Someone had died. Drugs were involved. The Adelaide men were being detained. By mid-morning, the ship's atmosphere had shifted. The festive energy of the night before curdled into something uneasy. People whispered at breakfast, avoided the disco. The pools were quieter than usual. Diane's 12-year-old daughter woke at 8 a.m. In the cabin, she shared with her mother and 2 family friends. Her mother wasn't there. She assumed Diane had gone to breakfast early, or to the pool. The friends were also puzzled, but not alarmed. It was nearly 10 a.m. when ship personnel knocked on their cabin door. A female crew member, a purser. They asked the friends to step outside. They told the daughter to wait in the room. Watch television. They'd be back soon. The conversation happened in a service corridor. Fluorescent lights, beige walls. The purser spoke carefully. There had been an incident. Diane had been found unresponsive. Medical staff had done everything possible. She had passed away. The friends asked how. The purser said they didn't have all the details yet. The body was being kept in a secure location. Arrangements were being made. The friends demanded to see Diane. The purser said that wouldn't be possible, not right now. The body was evidence. The friends began to cry. They asked how they were supposed to tell the daughter. The purser had no answer. They returned to the cabin. The daughter was watching cartoons. She looked up, saw their faces, and knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. They sat her down on the bed, told her as gently as they could. Her mother had become very sick during the night. The doctors had tried to help her, but she had died. The daughter didn't cry at first. She stared at them, asked if they were joking. They said no. She asked where her mother was. They said on the ship, in a safe place. She asked if she could see her. They said not yet. Then the daughter began to scream. A raw, animal sound. Crew members in adjacent cabins heard it. Some passengers later reported hearing a child's anguished wailing that morning and not knowing where it came from. The ship's counselor, a woman trained in basic grief support, was sent to the cabin. She sat with the daughter for 3 hours, explained what would happen next. The ship would return to Sydney early. The daughter would be taken care of. Her father would be contacted. The daughter asked questions. Was her mother alone when she died? The counselor said no, there were people with her. Did she suffer? The counselor said she didn't think so. Why did this happen? The counselor said they didn't know yet. The daughter cried until she vomited. Then she cried more. The Pacific Sky arrived in Noumea, New Caledonia, at 2 p.m. on September 25th. The port was picturesque. Turquoise water, palm trees, French colonial architecture. Under normal circumstances, passengers would have disembarked for shopping, snorkeling excursions, lunch at waterfront cafes. But the ship did not allow anyone off. Captain Warwick cited the mechanical issue. Passengers were upset. Some demanded refunds on the spot. The crew tried to placate them with free drinks, complimentary spa treatments. It helped, but not much. French authorities were notified of the death. 2 gendarmes came aboard. They were shown the body, shown the cabin. They took brief statements from the Adelaide men through a translator. But Noumea was not equipped to handle a complex investigation. The gendarmes conferred with the captain. Agreed the matter should be handled in Australia. The ship departed Noumea at 6 p.m. the same day. Turned west, back toward Sydney. The return voyage took 2 days. During that time, the Adelaide men were kept under loose supervision. They were told to remain in their cabins except for meals. But the ship's security couldn't enforce this rigorously. The men were seen in the bars, at the casino. Other passengers recognized them, confronted them. One woman spat at Mark Wilhelm in a corridor, called him a murderer. A male passenger shoved Ryan Kukul near the buffet, called him scum. The ship's crew intervened, separated people. But the tension was building. Some passengers demanded the men be locked up. The crew explained they had no legal authority to detain anyone without criminal charges. This was technically true, but it enraged people further. The Adelaide men, for their part, seemed unconcerned. Witnesses later testified at the inquest that they were seen laughing, drinking, playing slot machines. One passenger, a woman from Melbourne, claimed she overheard Mark Wilhelm at the bar say, "She took it herself, not our problem." Another passenger said he heard one of the men refer to Diane as "that bitch who ruined our cruise." These statements, if accurate, painted a picture of callousness that would haunt the men for years. The Pacific Sky arrived in Sydney Harbour on the morning of September 27th, 4 days after departure, 6 days ahead of schedule. The passengers disembarked slowly, in groups. The Adelaide men were held back. Australian Federal Police were waiting at the dock. 8 officers. They boarded the ship at 7 a.m. The men were taken to separate rooms, interviewed formally, read their rights. They were not arrested. Not yet. But their passports were confiscated. They were told not to leave Sydney. Diane's body was removed from the ship at 9 a.m. A private ambulance. No media present. P&O had requested a discreet transfer. But word had already leaked. By noon, the story was on local news. Woman dies on cruise ship. Drugs suspected. By evening, it was national. Diane's name was released. Her photo. A smiling portrait from a family gathering. She looked kind, approachable. The kind of person you'd trust. The contrast with the circumstances of her death was jarring. The autopsy was conducted at the New South Wales Coroner's Court in Glebe, Sydney. Dr. Johan Duflo, a senior forensic pathologist, performed the examination on September 28th. The external examination showed no signs of trauma, no defensive wounds, no bruising consistent with assault. The internal examination revealed pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. The brain showed signs of hypoxia, lack of oxygen. But the cause of death wasn't immediately clear from the physical examination alone. The toxicology results took 3 weeks. Blood and urine samples were sent to a specialized lab. On October 18th, the results came back. Diane's blood alcohol content at time of death was 0.12%, moderately intoxicated, but not lethally so. But the GHB level was extraordinary, 120 milligrams per liter. A typical recreational dose of GHB produces blood levels between 10 and 50 milligrams per liter. Diane's level was more than double the high end. It was, in medical terms, a massive overdose. The lab report noted that GHB in combination with alcohol is synergistic. Each amplifies the other's depressive effects on the central nervous system. Together, they can cause respiratory arrest, which is what happened to Diane. Dr. Duflo's official cause of death: toxicity due to combined effects of alcohol and gamma-hydroxybutyrate. Manner of death was left open pending investigation. It could be accidental. If Diane had taken the GHB herself, misjudged the dose. It could be misadventure. If she'd taken it recreationally, but without understanding the risks. Or it could be homicide. If someone had given it to her without her knowledge or consent in a dose they knew, or should have known, could be fatal. The question of consent became central. Had Diane taken GHB willingly? The Adelaide men claimed yes. They said she was experienced with party drugs, that she'd asked for it, but there was no evidence to support this. Friends and family said Diane didn't use drugs. She drank socially, but nothing more. The toxicology showed no other substances in her system, no history of drug use. The autopsy found no needle marks, no scarring consistent with chronic drug use. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary woman who'd accepted a drink she thought was safe. The public reaction was swift and furious. Diane's story struck a nerve. She was a mother. She'd been on a family cruise with her daughter. She'd trusted an environment marketed as safe, wholesome, fun. And she'd been drugged, exploited, and left to die by men who then showed no remorse. The Adelaide men became national villains. Their names were published: Mark Wilhelm, Ryan Kuchel, Letterio Silvestri, Matthew Slade, Dragan Losic, Luigi Vitale, Charlie Camburis, Wilhelm Wilhelms. The Adelaide Eight. They received death threats. Their homes were vandalized. One had his car set on fire. They hired lawyers, refused further interviews. P&O cruises faced intense scrutiny. How had this happened on one of their ships? Why hadn't crew intervened when a visibly intoxicated woman was taken to a cabin by multiple men? Why was GHB so readily available aboard? Why was the initial investigation so poorly handled? The cruise line issued a statement expressing condolences to Diane's family, said they were cooperating fully with authorities, announced a review of onboard security procedures. But the damage was done. Bookings for Pacific Sky cruises dropped 30% in the following quarter. The ship was repositioned to Asian routes, away from Australian passengers who now associated it with tragedy. Diane's family retained a lawyer, prepared for a long fight. Her ex-husband, Mark Brimble, though divorced from Diane, became the public face of the family's quest for justice. He gave interviews, demanded accountability. He said Diane had been a devoted mother, a good person. She deserved better than to die alone and afraid, in a cabin full of strangers who treated her as disposable. The New South Wales Coroner's Office announced a formal inquest. It would examine the circumstances of Diane's death, determine what happened, who was responsible, whether criminal charges were warranted. The inquest was scheduled to begin in 2006, 4 years away. The wheels of justice, especially maritime justice, turned slowly. In the meantime, the Pacific Sky continued to sail. Different passengers, different routes. The ship breathed. The ship forgot. Cabin D182 was cleaned, repainted, rented out to new guests who had no idea what had happened there. The ship moved through water, carrying people across borders, into jurisdictions where questions dissolve, where evidence grows cold, where the dead are simply logged and stored, and eventually return to land where someone else must decide what their death means. The coronial inquest into Diane Brimble's death opened on October 16, 2006, 4 years and 1 month after she died. The delay was not unusual. Maritime cases are complex. Jurisdictional issues, international crew, evidence scattered across countries. The inquest was held at the New South Wales Coroner's Court in Glebe, a suburb of Sydney. The building was brick, institutional. The courtroom seated approximately 60 people. Media filled half the benches. Diane's family took the front rows. The Adelaide men sat together on the opposite side, flanked by their lawyers. The coroner was Jacqueline Millage, 53 years old, former prosecutor, known for thoroughness. She would hear from more than 100 witnesses over the course of 3 years. The inquest would sit for 78 days total, not consecutively, in blocks. Weeks at a time, then months of adjournment while evidence was compiled, witnesses located, legal arguments prepared. It was, by any measure, exhaustive. The first witnesses were crew members from the Pacific Sky. The ship's doctor described arriving at cabin D-182, finding Diane on the floor, pale, unresponsive. He walked the court through his resuscitation efforts. 23 minutes of CPR, defibrillation attempts. Nothing worked. He said he'd suspected drug overdose immediately based on the scene, the men's evasiveness, the smell of alcohol. He'd taken blood samples, requested they be preserved. He'd done everything he could with the resources available on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. The ship's security officers testified next. They admitted the initial investigation was flawed. The memory card from the camera should have been secured immediately. It wasn't. One officer had taken it. Lost track of it. A crew member, a bartender from the Philippines, later admitted he'd stolen it. Thought it might have valuable information. He'd tried to view the photos on his laptop. Couldn't access them. Panicked. Reformatted the card. Then handed it to another officer. The officer gave it to Australian Federal Police when the ship docked. By then, the photos appeared to be gone. But they weren't. The AFP's digital forensics unit sent the memory card to Canberra. Specialists there used recovery software. Reformatting doesn't actually erase data. It just marks the space as available. If nothing has been written over it, the original files can be recovered. In this case, they recovered 150 photos. Time-stamped. Dated September 23rd and 24th, 2002. The photos were entered into evidence. Sealed. The court was cleared of media and public for the viewing. Only the coroner, lawyers, and immediate family members were present. Those who saw the photos described them in only the vaguest terms in open court. Diane, in various states of undress. Diane on the floor. The men, grinning, posing. The timestamps showed the progression. Early photos, around 2 a.m., showed Diane appearing conscious but heavily intoxicated. Later photos, after 4 a.m., showed her unconscious, motionless. One photo showed a man placing his foot on her torso. Another showed 2 men making obscene gestures over her body. The coroner later stated that the photos demonstrated Diane was incapable of consent, that she had been degraded, that the men were aware of her condition and exploited it. Diane's family left the courtroom in tears after the viewing. Mark Brimble, her ex-husband, told reporters outside that the photos were worse than he'd imagined, that he couldn't understand how human beings could treat another person that way. He said Diane had been alone in that cabin with men who saw her as an object. Not a mother, not a person. An object. The inquest then turned to other passengers. Witnesses who'd been on the ship that night. A woman named Sandra Haynes testified she'd seen the Adelaide men at the Palace nightclub. Said they'd been aggressive, propositioning every woman they encountered. She said one of them had approached her friend, a 15-year-old girl, and asked if she wanted to party. Asked if she'd take her top off. The girl had been terrified. Sandra had intervened, told the man to leave. He'd laughed, called her a prude. Another passenger, David Chen, testified he'd seen Mark Wilhelm offering small bottles to women at the bar, asking if they wanted to feel good. Chen didn't know what was in the bottles, assumed it was alcohol. But later, after Diane's death, he realized it must have been GHB. He said he regretted not saying something to ship security at the time, but it had seemed like normal cruise behavior. People drinking, flirting. You don't expect something sinister. A crew member, a cocktail waitress named Maria Santos, testified that the Adelaide men had harassed her repeatedly over the first night, asked her to come to their cabin after her shift, offered her money, touched her without permission. She'd reported it to her supervisor, but nothing was done. The supervisor, she said, told her to avoid them. Stay professional. Don't make a scene. This testimony raised questions about P&O's response to misconduct. Why hadn't the men been warned, monitored more closely, removed from the ship? The inquest heard from Dr. Duflou, the pathologist. He explained the pharmacology of GHB in detail, how it works, how it's metabolized, why the dose Diane received was so dangerous. He said that GHB has a very narrow therapeutic window. The difference between a dose that produces euphoria and a dose that produces unconsciousness or death is small. Maybe 5 milliliters, a teaspoon. He said mixing it with alcohol makes it exponentially more dangerous. Alcohol inhibits the enzymes that break down GHB, so it stays in the system longer, builds up. He testified that in his professional opinion, Diane's GHB level was not consistent with self-administration. It was too high. Most people, even experienced users, would pass out before ingesting that much. Someone else had to have given it to her. This testimony was crucial. It shifted the narrative from accidental overdose to something darker. Someone had administered a lethal dose. Whether intentionally or recklessly, that was the question. But the act itself was now established. The Adelaide men were called to testify. Mark Wilhelm went first. He was 31 years old at the time of the inquest. Stocky, shaved head. He wore a suit, spoke quietly. He admitted he'd given Diane GHB, said she'd asked for it, said he'd told her what it was, said she'd taken it willingly. He estimated he'd given her maybe 5 milliliters, a capful from the bottle he carried. He said he'd also taken some himself that night. He said Diane had been flirtatious. They'd danced. She'd agreed to come back to his cabin. He said they'd had sex. Consensual, he insisted. Then she'd seemed fine, talking, laughing. Then suddenly, she became unresponsive. He said he'd tried to wake her, slapped her face, shook her. Nothing worked. He'd panicked. Eventually called for medical help. The coroner asked why he'd waited so long to call. Wilhelm said he didn't realize how serious it was at first. Thought she'd just passed out. He said that in his experience with GHB, people passed out sometimes. They woke up later. He didn't know she was dying. The coroner asked about the photos. Why take photos of an unconscious woman? Wilhelm had no answer, said he didn't remember taking most of them, said he was drunk and high himself, didn't think clearly, admitted it was wrong. Ryan Kuchel testified next. He claimed he'd been asleep in the top bunk for most of the night, said he'd woken briefly, seen Diane on the floor, assumed she was drunk, went back to sleep. Didn't realize she was in medical distress. The coroner pressed him. How could he sleep through CPR being performed in a cabin the size of a small bedroom? Kuchel said he was a heavy sleeper, had drunk a lot, taken GHB himself. His memory was hazy. The coroner's skepticism was evident. Letterio Silvestri testified he hadn't been in the cabin when Diane died. He'd been at the casino. Security footage confirmed he'd been at a blackjack table until nearly 6 a.m. His story checked out. But he admitted he'd been in the cabin earlier. Had seen Diane there. She'd been conscious, he said, sitting on a bed, talking to Wilhelm. Silvestri said he'd left because the cabin was too crowded. He claimed he didn't know Diane was in trouble until he returned and found paramedics there. The other men gave similar testimony. Vague memories. Alcohol and drugs. Didn't realize the severity. Each insisted Diane had taken GHB willingly, that she'd been a willing participant in everything that happened. But their stories had inconsistencies, timelines that didn't match, details that contradicted each other. The coroner noted these discrepancies repeatedly. The inquest also examined P&O's policies. The cruise line's director of safety testified. He explained that in 2002, there were no specific protocols for handling suspected drugging incidents. Crew were trained to recognize intoxication, but not to distinguish between alcohol and other substances. There were no drug dogs, no routine searches of passenger luggage. GHB was legal to possess in small amounts in some Australian states at the time. It wasn't explicitly banned on the ship. The company relied on passengers to behave responsibly. The coroner asked about surveillance. Why were there no cameras in the corridors? The director explained that CCTV was expensive, and passengers valued privacy. Cameras in hallways near cabins would be seen as intrusive. The ship had cameras in public areas, the casino, the atrium, the gangways, but not in residential corridors. This meant there was no footage of Diane being taken to cabin D182. No visual record of her condition, whether she walked on her own or was carried, whether she appeared willing or incapacitated. The director also testified about the ship's medical capabilities. The facility was adequate for emergencies, but not equipped for complex toxicology. They couldn't test for GHB on board, couldn't definitively diagnose what was happening to Diane in real time. By the time the doctor arrived, she was already in cardiac arrest. The window for intervention had closed. Diane's family testified. Her sister Coral, her ex-husband Mark, her daughter, now 16, did not testify. The coroner spared her. Coral described Diane as trusting, naive maybe, but in a good way. She believed in people, thought the best of them. She'd never used drugs, Coral insisted. Wouldn't have known what GHB was. If someone offered it to her, she would have assumed it was safe, especially in the environment of a cruise ship. Everything there was designed to feel safe. Supervised, controlled. Mark Brimble testified for nearly 2 hours. He explained that he and Diane had divorced amicably, remained friends, co-parented well. He said Diane had been excited about the cruise, saw it as a fresh start after the divorce, a chance to relax. He said she'd called him from the ship on the afternoon of September 23rd, just before they left port. She'd been happy. Laughing, said the ship was beautiful, that their daughter was having fun already. That was the last time he spoke to her. The next day, he received a call from P&O. His ex-wife was dead. No details. Just dead. He'd collapsed. Couldn't process it. He said he'd spent the last 4 years trying to understand how a cruise ship, a place marketed to families, could allow his daughter's mother to be drugged and killed. Expert witnesses testified about GHB. Pharmacologists. Toxicologists. They explained how the drug is metabolized, how quickly it leaves the bloodstream. This was important because GHB has a short half-life. It's detectable in blood for only about 12 hours. In urine, maybe 24. Diane's samples had been taken promptly, which allowed for accurate measurement. If the ship's doctor hadn't had the foresight to take those samples, the GHB might not have been detected at all. The death could have been attributed to alcohol alone, or even natural causes. A psychiatrist testified about the psychology of group behavior, explained how individuals might act differently in a group than they would alone, how responsibility diffuses, how one person's aggression can normalize behavior for others. This was relevant to understanding how 8 men could be complicit, even if only 1 or 2 actively harmed Diane. The others watched, photographed, laughed, did nothing. In a legal sense, their inaction made them complicit. The inquest stretched into 2007, then 2008. Adjournments, more witnesses, legal arguments about what evidence was admissible. The Adelaide men's lawyers fought hard, argued that much of the testimony was hearsay, that the photos, while disturbing, didn't prove criminal intent, that Diane's death, while tragic, was ultimately the result of her own choices. She'd gone to the cabin, she'd accepted drinks, she'd engaged with the men, but the coroner wasn't convinced. In private hearings, she questioned the men aggressively, asked why, if Diane had taken GHB willingly, they'd given her so much, why they hadn't monitored her, why they'd taken photos instead of getting help immediately, why they'd lied to the ship's doctor, said she overdosed on her own when they'd admitted giving her the drug. By 2009, the inquest was winding down. Final submissions. The coroner took months to prepare her findings. The report was released in April 2010. 347 pages. It detailed every aspect of Diane's death. The timeline, the toxicology, the behavior of the men, the failures of the cruise line. The findings were damning. Coroner Millage concluded that Diane Brimble died from a toxic combination of alcohol and GHB, that the GHB was administered to her without her informed consent, that Mark Wilhelm had given her a dangerous dose, either recklessly or intentionally, that the other men present in the cabin were complicit through their inaction, that Diane had been degraded and exploited in her final hours, that the men had shown a callous disregard for her life and dignity. The coroner also criticized P&O Cruises, found that the company's safety protocols were inadequate, that crew training was insufficient, that the initial investigation had been mishandled. She made 43 recommendations: install CCTV in corridors, provide better training for crew to recognize drugging, implement stricter drug policies, improve medical facilities, ensure proper evidence handling. Most were adopted, some weren't. The coroner referred the matter to the Director of Public Prosecutions, recommended that Mark Wilhelm be charged with manslaughter, recommended others be charged as accessories or with perverting the course of justice. The DPP reviewed the evidence, took 6 months. In September 2010, charges were filed. Mark Wilhelm, manslaughter and supplying a prohibited drug. Letterio Silvestri, perverting the course of justice for allegedly helping dispose of evidence. The trial was scheduled for 2011, but it never happened. Wilhelm's lawyers negotiated. The prosecution's case was strong, but not airtight. 8 years had passed. Memories had faded. Some witnesses had died or couldn't be located. The photos were powerful evidence, but didn't definitively prove Wilhelm knew the dose would be lethal. A manslaughter conviction requires proving recklessness or gross negligence. Difficult when the defendant claims ignorance. In March 2011, Wilhelm pleaded guilty to a lesser charge: administering a stupefying drug with intent to commit an indictable offense. Essentially, drugging Diane to facilitate sexual assault. The manslaughter charge was dropped. The judge sentenced him to 18 months imprisonment, wholly suspended, meaning he served no actual jail time. He was also fined $5,000. The courtroom erupted. Diane's family screamed. Mark Brimble had to be restrained. How could a man who admitted giving a fatal dose of drugs to a woman serve no time? The judge explained that Wilhelm had no prior criminal record, had shown remorse. The delay in prosecution meant he'd already lived under the shadow of the case for 9 years. Jail time wasn't warranted under the circumstances. Outside the courthouse, Mark Brimble spoke to media. His face was red, tear-streaked. He said justice had not been served. that Diane's life was worth more than a suspended sentence. That the system had failed her. Again. He said he would continue fighting, pushing for reforms, making sure Diane's death meant something. The charges against Letterio Silvestri were also dropped. Insufficient evidence. The other 6 men of the Adelaide Eight were never charged. They returned to their lives. Some changed their names, moved cities, tried to disappear from public view. But the internet doesn't forget their faces, their names. Forever associated with Diane Brimble's death, the legal outcome left a bitter taste. 18 months suspended, $5,000. That was the price, apparently, of Diane Brimble's life. The Australian public was outraged. Petitions circulated. Thousands of signatures demanding the Director of Public Prosecutions appeal the sentence. But appeals are complex. The prosecution had already compromised by accepting the lesser plea. To appeal would require proving the sentence was manifestly inadequate, and suspended sentences, while lenient, were not unusual for first-time offenders in cases without clear intent to kill. Mark Wilhelm disappeared from public view after sentencing. He'd moved during the inquest years, changed jobs, tried to rebuild, but his name was poisoned. Employers who discovered his identity let him go. Neighbors recognized him, confronted him. His car was vandalized repeatedly, tires slashed, windows broken. Graffiti, murderer, rapist. He eventually left South Australia entirely, moved interstate. The last confirmed sighting was in 2013. After that, nothing. Some speculated he'd changed his name legally. Others thought he might have left Australia. The truth is unknown. The other men of the Adelaide Eight scattered similarly. Ryan Kushel was spotted working at a warehouse in Melbourne in 2012. Someone recognized him, posted about it online. Within days, he'd quit. Letterio Silvestri was reported to be living in Queensland under a different name. These were unconfirmed rumors, but they illustrate the lasting consequences. Not legal consequences, social ones. The men were marked pariahs, which some saw as appropriate, others as vigilante justice. The law had spoken, however inadequately. What right did the public have to continue punishing them? Diane's family saw things differently. Mark Brimble became a vocal advocate for cruise ship safety reform. He partnered with an organization called International Cruise Victims Association. The ICV was founded in 2006 by families of people who died or disappeared on cruise ships. They advocated for better safety standards, transparency from cruise lines, legal reforms to close jurisdictional loopholes. Maritime law is complex. When a crime occurs in international waters on a foreign-flagged ship, determining which country's laws apply can be murky. Prosecution often falls through the cracks. Mark Brimble testified before Australian parliamentary committees, shared Diane's story, pushed for legislation requiring cruise lines to report crimes, to preserve evidence properly, to cooperate with law enforcement. Some of his advocacy bore fruit. In 2012, Australia passed amendments to maritime laws, requiring cruise operators to have better medical facilities, to install surveillance in more areas, to train crew in evidence preservation. It wasn't everything the ICV wanted, but it was progress. P&O Cruises also implemented changes. The company released a statement in 2011 acknowledging failures in how Diane's case was handled. They announced new policies: zero tolerance for illegal drugs, random searches of passenger luggage, drug detection dogs at embarkation ports, increased security patrols in nightclub areas, better training for bar staff to recognize signs of drugging. These measures were publicized heavily. P&O needed to rebuild trust. Bookings had suffered. The Pacific Sky, in particular, was stigmatized. The ship itself was sold in 2007. P&O offloaded it to a Chinese operator. It was renamed Henna, refitted, painted, put into service running routes in Asia. The sale was presented as routine fleet management. But industry insiders understood. The Pacific sky was tainted. Australian passengers didn't want to cruise on the ship where Diane Brimble died. Selling it allowed P&O to distance themselves. The Henna sailed for another decade under Chinese ownership, was finally scrapped in 2018. Broken apart in an Indian shipyard, its steel recycled. Cabin D-182 dismantled. The physical space where Diane died ceased to exist, but the story persisted. It became a cautionary tale. Australian media revisited it regularly, on anniversaries, when similar incidents occurred. In 2013, a woman disappeared from a Carnival cruise ship in the Caribbean. Media coverage immediately referenced Diane Brimble, drew parallels, questioned whether the industry had really changed. In 2016, a man fell overboard from a Royal Caribbean ship off the Australian coast. Again, Diane's case was mentioned, a reminder of how vulnerable passengers can be. The cruise industry bristled at this narrative. They pointed to safety statistics. Millions of passengers cruise annually. Incidents are rare. The media sensationalizes, focuses on outliers, makes people afraid of something statistically safer than driving. This is true, in a narrow sense. Deaths per passenger mile on cruise ships are lower than on roads. But the nature of cruise ship incidents is different. When something goes wrong at sea, help is far away. Evidence is compromised, witnesses scatter. The crime scene moves across borders. And cruise lines have financial incentives to minimize, to resolve quietly, to avoid publicity that damages bookings. Diane's daughter, whose name was kept out of media at the family's request, grew up in the shadow of her mother's death. She was 12 when it happened, 21 when the case finally concluded with Wilhelm's sentencing. 9 years of her adolescence and young adulthood consumed by inquests, testimonies, media attention. She gave a single interview in 2014, anonymously, to a documentary crew. She spoke about the trauma, not just of losing her mother, but of how she lost her, the public nature of it, the humiliating details, the photos she'd never seen but knew existed. She said she'd struggled with trust, with anxiety, had gone through therapy for years. She said she didn't go on the cruise to have fun. She went to spend time with her mother, and instead, she watched her mother leave for the nightclub and never come back. The documentary was titled Death on the High Seas, The Diane Brimble Story. It aired on Australian television in 2015. Featured interviews with Mark Brimble, Diane's sister Coral, the ship's doctor, passengers who'd been aboard, investigators. It did not include any of the Adelaide men. They'd all declined to participate. The documentary was watched by 1.3 million Australians. It reignited public discussion. Social media filled with comments. Anger at the men. Sympathy for Diane. Debates about personal responsibility versus predatory behavior. Some commenters blamed Diane, said she shouldn't have gone to a cabin with strange men, shouldn't have accepted drinks from people she didn't know, should have been more careful. This victim blaming enraged others. They pointed out that Diane had been drugged. Drugging someone removes their capacity to make decisions. You can't blame a person for not protecting themselves from something they didn't know was happening. The debate was heated, predictable. It happens in nearly every case involving drugs and sexual assault. But beneath the anger and argument was something else. Fear. The recognition that what happened to Diane could happen to anyone. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She was on a vacation, dancing, having drinks, being social. These are normal cruise activities, normal vacation activities. The fear was that normalcy, that trust in the environment, could be exploited so easily, that predators could operate in plain sight, that institutions, cruise lines, security, even the legal system, could fail so comprehensively. P&O settled a civil lawsuit with Diane's family in 2011. The terms were confidential, but reports suggested a payout in the mid-six figures. The family used some of the money to establish a foundation, the Diane Brimble Foundation. Its mission was to raise awareness about drink spiking, to educate young people about the dangers of accepting drinks from strangers, to push for better safety on cruise ships. The foundation partnered with schools, held workshops, distributed informational materials. It was a way to channel grief into action, to make Diane's death mean something beyond tragedy. The foundation's website featured Diane's photo, the same smiling portrait that had been in the media, but also photos of her with her children, at family gatherings, playing with her grandchildren. Yes, she'd become a grandmother before she died. Her oldest child had a baby in 2001. Diane had been excited about it, talked about taking the grandchild on outings, building memories. The foundation's messaging emphasized this. Diane wasn't just a victim. She was a person, a mother, a grandmother, a daughter, a sister. She had value beyond the circumstances of her death. The cruise industry continued to evolve. Technology helped. By the late 2010s, most major cruise lines had comprehensive CCTV coverage, not just in public areas, but in corridors, on exterior decks, near elevators. Privacy concerns remained, but safety won out. The cameras served dual purposes: deterrence and evidence. If someone went missing, footage could show their last known location. If an assault occurred, cameras might capture suspects entering or leaving a cabin. It wasn't perfect. Cameras don't prevent all crimes. But they changed the calculus for would-be offenders. Medical facilities on ships also improved. Larger vessels, the megaships carrying 5,000-plus passengers, began installing CT scanners, more sophisticated lab equipment, telemedicine links to shore-based hospitals. The goal was to handle serious emergencies at sea without needing to divert to port or evacuate by helicopter. This cost money, but it also reduced liability. If someone died at sea and the ship could demonstrate they'd provided adequate medical care, lawsuits were harder to win. Drug policies tightened across the industry. Random searches became routine. Sniffer dogs at embarkation. Severe penalties for passengers caught with illegal substances. In some cases, immediate disembarkment at the next port, at the passenger's expense. No refund. The cruise lines framed this as safety, but it was also risk management. Fewer drugs on board meant fewer overdoses, fewer assaults, fewer incidents like Diane's. But some critics argued these measures were reactive, not proactive, that they addressed symptoms, not root causes. The real issue, they said, was culture. The culture of excess that cruise lines marketed. Unlimited alcohol packages, nightclubs that ran until dawn, advertising that emphasized indulgence, letting loose, escaping normal rules. This culture attracted certain types of people, created environments where boundaries blurred, where what happens on the cruise stays on the cruise became an excuse for behavior people would never consider at home. Mark Brimble made this argument repeatedly in his advocacy. He said cruise lines couldn't have it both ways. Couldn't market hedonism and then act surprised when people behaved hedonistically. If you sell unlimited drinks to thousands of people trapped on a floating resort, some will drink to excess. If you create nightclubs designed for hookups, some people will pursue sex aggressively. If you foster an anything-goes atmosphere, predators will thrive. The industry needed to reconcile the tension between profit from excess and responsibility for consequences. The cruise lines responded that they weren't responsible for individual choices, that adults must take responsibility for their own behavior, that no amount of corporate policy can prevent someone determined to commit a crime. This was true, but incomplete. Environments shape behavior. Design matters. Lighting, surveillance, staff training, intervention protocols, all influence outcomes. The question wasn't whether cruise lines could prevent all crimes. It was whether they were doing enough to prevent foreseeable ones. Diane's case became a teaching tool. Criminology courses examined it. Maritime law classes used it. Medical schools discussed it in toxicology modules. The case had everything: drugs, jurisdictional complexity, corporate liability, forensic challenges, evidence mishandling, delayed prosecution. It illustrated how systems could fail at every level, and how those failures, compounded, could deny justice. But it also showed resilience. Diane's family didn't give up. They fought for 8 years. Through the inquest, through the trial, through the disappointing sentencing. They kept her memory alive, kept pressure on authorities, kept the case in public consciousness. Without their advocacy, Wilhelm might never have been charged. The inquest might have concluded with a simple finding: accidental death. Woman took drugs voluntarily, misjudged the dose. Case closed. Instead, the truth emerged, slowly, painfully, incompletely, but enough to establish what happened. Enough to hold someone accountable, however inadequately. In 2022, 20 years after Diane's death, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation produced a podcast series about the case. 6 episodes, titled The Pacific Sky. It re-examined the evidence, interviewed people involved, explored the lasting impact on cruise safety. The podcast found that some of the Adelaide men were still alive, still in Australia, living under their original names. One had married, had children, worked a normal job. The podcast didn't reveal his identity or location, but knowing he existed, somewhere, living an ordinary life while Diane's family still grieved felt obscene to many listeners. The podcast also revealed that Cabin D-182, before the ship was scrapped, had been photographed extensively. A maritime historian had toured the Henna in 2016, documented its layout. The cabin looked different by then. Refurbished. New carpets. New bedding. But the dimensions were the same. The historian described it: 4.2 meters long, 2.8 meters wide, 11.7 square meters total, roughly 126 square feet. The bathroom added another 2 square meters. In that tiny space, 4 men and Diane had been crammed. The historian noted how claustrophobic it must have felt, how intimate, how impossible for anything to happen without everyone being aware. This detail resurfaced questions asked during the inquest. How could the other men claim not to know what was happening? The space was too small for ignorance. Every sound, every movement, visible, audible. If Diane was in distress, they knew. If she was unconscious on the floor, they saw. Their inaction was a choice. Whether legally culpable or not, morally they were complicit. Diane's daughter, now in her 30s, released a statement through the foundation in 2023. It was the first time she'd publicly acknowledged the anniversary in years. She said she thought about her mother every day, wondered who she would have become, what their relationship would be like now. She said her mother had missed everything: her graduation, her wedding, the birth of her own children. Diane had 3 grandchildren she'd never met, would never meet. The statement ended simply: "I miss you, Mom. I hope you're at peace." The cruise industry has grown exponentially since 2002. More ships, larger ships, more passengers. In 2002, roughly 10 million people took cruises globally. By 2023, that number exceeded 30 million. The industry is worth more than $50 billion annually. It employs over 1 million people worldwide. Ships have become floating cities. Some carry 7,000 passengers. They have parks, zip lines, ice rinks, Broadway theaters. They are engineering marvels, testaments to human ambition and ingenuity. But they are also closed systems, governed by complex laws, operated by corporations focused on profit, staffed by underpaid crew from developing nations, frequented by passengers who often don't understand the unique vulnerabilities of being at sea. When something goes wrong, the consequences are amplified by isolation, by the difficulty of investigation, by the way evidence degrades in salt air, in the movement of water, in the passage of time between incident and landfall. Diane Brimble's story is a reminder of these vulnerabilities. She boarded the Pacific Sky expecting a vacation, 10 days of sunshine and relaxation. She got 18 hours, one night, one encounter with the wrong people, one drink laced with something she didn't recognize, and her life ended on the floor of a cabin smaller than most people's bedrooms, surrounded by strangers who photographed her humiliation and did nothing until it was too late. Her legacy is complicated. The reforms that followed her death made cruising marginally safer. But they didn't eliminate risk. Couldn't eliminate it. Human beings carry their capacities for harm wherever they go. Ships, cities, anywhere people gather, predators can operate. The question is whether institutions respond, whether they prioritize safety over profit, whether they hold perpetrators accountable or protect them. In Diane's case, the response was mixed. The coroner did her job, thoroughly, painstakingly. But the prosecution faltered. The sentence was a joke. The cruise line paid money, but admitted no wrongdoing. The men, save one, faced no legal consequences. They lived their lives. Changed their names, maybe. Moved on. While Diane's family carried the weight forever, there is no neat conclusion to this story. No moment of closure. Justice wasn't served, not really. But Diane is remembered. Her name means something. When people talk about cruise ship safety, her case comes up. When families board cruise ships, some think of her. Take precautions. Watch their drinks. Stay vigilant. Maybe that saves someone. Maybe it doesn't. But her death forced a conversation, exposed a darkness beneath the polished white hulls and festive advertising. The Pacific Sky is gone now, scrapped, recycled into rebar and sheet metal. Cabin D-182 exists only in photographs, in court documents, in the memories of those who were there. But Diane remains, in the faces of her children, her grandchildren, in the work of the foundation that bears her name, in the reforms, however incomplete, that followed her death. She was 42 years old, a mother of 3. She liked to sing, to dance, to laugh. She trusted people, maybe too much. She wanted a vacation, a break from the ordinary pressures of life. She deserved to have that. She deserved to come home, to hug her daughter, to grow old, to meet her grandchildren. She deserved justice when she was denied all of that. She didn't get it, not fully, but her story endures. A warning, a tragedy, a reminder that even in places designed for joy, darkness can intrude, and when it does, the response matters. The pursuit of truth matters. Accountability matters, even when it comes too late, even when it's incomplete. It matters because she mattered. Diane Brimble mattered, and we should not forget that.